Good afternoon. My name is John Garafola. I'm an information security analyst here at Emporia State University. Thank you for joining us for the afternoon session of the Czech Virtual Conference 2020. I have the privilege of introducing two gentlemen from Kansas State University. They'll be going over the what, why, and how of service mapping. They've prepared an introduction, so I won't step on their toes at all. And without any further ado, Chuck and Charles. Take it away, gentlemen.
There we are. Okay. Yeah. Hey, I'm Chuck with K-State. Yeah, we want to talk to you a little bit about process mapping, specifically creating process maps, how we make process maps, and Charles will talk a little bit about why we did process mappings. And it'll come down to a really cool little live demo where we make a process map together, and it'll be super cool and fancy and this wonderful experience we get to share together. So let me do a little screen share here.
Well, let me introduce myself before you do that, Chuck.
Oh, the screen share has our names. I was going to let you introduce yourself with your name there. So go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Charles Appleseth, and as mentioned before, we're from K-State. I am an IT coordinator, and I have recently moved into a new unit at K-State as part of our reorg, which is strategy planning and enterprise architecture. So that's a little bit about me. Chuck is going to show some pictures of some process maps while I am talking a little bit about why we got interested in this. So with that, Chuck will take that away, and then we'll get into the main presentation. So one of the things that was a motivator for us was that at K-State, we had a ITS reorg that was going to be happening. And this was in conjunction with several other restructurings that were going on at K-State. And so there was the possibility of teams getting split or people moved from teams to other areas. And we thought that there was a need to show who were critical people in critical parts of processes that were going on to help with that decision making. Another goal that we had, and this is one that was even outside of the reorg, is that our unit at the time, known as ITAC, is very customer service focused. So that's one of our primary areas. And so we were always looking for ways to provide better service to our customers. And this appeared to be a way that we could help do that too. And so we were looking at using process mapping for the purpose of process improvement. And so that's a little bit of why we got into it. Another motivating factor at K-State, and everybody on this call has probably had the same thing, but we've all got budget concerns with the state. So that's always an issue. And these are another tool that can be used to help with the idea of doing more with less. And so if you can gain efficiencies, you can also use these maps to look at maybe areas that are taking time but aren't of much value and things of that nature. And so that's a little bit of why we got into that. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and start. On our first slide here, we have a formal definition of process mapping. What's important to know here of what process mapping is that it's a visual tool to show the flow of work. So that's the main area. It conveys a lot of information, so it shows who and what is involved in a process that can be used in any business or organization. And so those are kind of the key elements of it. And the other thing in this definition, just to note, is that you may hear alternate terms. So we're all probably familiar with hearing the term flow chart. There's several variations of that. And there are, the other thing that you'll notice too is sometimes this is referred to as process modeling. The big distinction between calling it mapping versus modeling is usually on what you're doing with it. So if you're using it for process improvement, where you're looking at existing processes, it's usually referred to as mapping, because you're taking something that exists and making a map for it. If you're designing a new service, that would be a process where you're making a model for that service. So Chuck, if you can move me forward here. Another thing too, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there is a standard way of doing process mapping. So there is a thing known as BPMN. This is business process model and notation. So this is a standard notation that is used. And we recommend that if you are interested in doing your own mapping, to use this. This allows you to share your maps with other people and be able to collaborate and not have to do a lot of explaining of what your maps mean. So if you have to go through and do a lot of explaining, then that kind of defeats the purpose of the map, which is supposed to be a quick way to summarize information. One thing we are going to note, we're not going to show it, is BPMN has on the order of several hundred symbols that get used in it. And we will, in our tip section, talk about how to get started. You don't need to worry about that. So that's something that can be intimidating for people that are just starting out. And in reality, just to get yourself rolling, you really only need to know a handful of those, and we're going to go through what those are. So why use process mapping? So I talked a little bit about why our area in K-State was interested in using this. And there are several just kind of general reasons that can apply to anyone. So as I said before, these will show who does what and when. So it provides information at that level. They can be used for process improvement, which was the purpose we were looking for. They are an efficient way to develop new processes and services. So if you are needing to start a new service, this is a good way to plan it out before the service goes live. They do provide a lot of information with minimal text or writing, so they are a good summary tool. Another area that often doesn't get looked at is that these can help with training of new staff members. So if you are in an area where you're needing to bring new people on, these are a great way to walk somebody through the processes that they'll be using for their on-the-job experience. So they can be great training tools. And these also help in times of organizational change, which was, again, one of our motivators, because they can show if teams are being restructured, they can highlight areas where attention would be needed to make sure that things don't fall through the cracks with that move. Taking one step back to our introduction, as I'd mentioned, we were going into a reorg, and one of the results of that is when Chuck and I had pushed this proposal to check, we were on the same team. Currently, we are not. So that was one thing that both of us moved away from our parent team, so to speak, that we were in when we first started this. But we are still working together.
Begrudgingly.
Okay, Chuck, move us forward.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, this is when I get to talk again. So yeah, we wanted to go over some tips on creating a process map. So 1 and 2 are kind of closely tied together here. So 1, you need to start with a scope, a single business process you want to do, a single, service you're providing. You don't want to try and lump in like everything your group does. It's just going to make a giant mess. So start with a very clearly defined, like I want to process this one specific, or I want to map this one specific business process, and just stick with that. Because it feeds into 2. You only want to map one process at a time. Trying to diagram all of these different processes on a single map, not only does it break the best practice, but it makes it a very complicated, just a mess of spaghetti, like lines everywhere, makes it very difficult to read, interpret, and actually gain any useful information out of. But going through this process, you are going to have times where you come across, the process you're working on will need to reference another process. And so that's a time when you would use something called a sub-process box. And we'll go over that later. But that's kind of how you want to start with a clearly defined scope. I'm doing this. And you only want to work on one process at a time, just for simplicity's sake, and to make sure that you're creating a map that you can actually use and get useful information out of. Next up is when you're doing a process map, you want to start at the beginning and you want to work through it step by step. I have created some monstrously huge process maps before. They're highly complicated. They involve a lot of teams. There's lines going all over the place. And if I tried to like envision that in my head all at once, it would be confusing. It would be complicated. And the way you kind of deal with that to make it manageable and to help you keep track of everything is to just do it step by step. Start it, start. And then usually starts always, customer identifies a need. And then you just take it from there and you work it through piece by piece. And eventually you can get through it without it, becoming too wildly frustrating. So yeah, step by step, start at the beginning. It makes it way easier.
So another thing that's really important for process maps, and you might have seen some of these in the small pictures we were showing at the beginning, and we'll highlight these when we get to our build example, are things called swim lanes. So what these are lanes on your drawing, your diagram, and they are used to designate different people that are involved. So for example, if we'll take an example back from our ITAC days of if a customer contacted in, they might contact our help desk and they would provide tier 1 support. If it was something they couldn't resolve, it would move into a second tier support. If tier 2 couldn't resolve it, then it would move on to upper tier, for example. And so with that example, you would have 4 swim lanes. So you would have one for the customer, because that's where it starts. You would have our help desk, which would be our tier 1, and our tier 2 and tier 3 would be the other lanes. And so these are really important because they are the way you designate who does what at the team level. You could do it for the individual level too, per se, if you were wanting to do something that fine grained, but usually it's at the team level. Now, one thing we'll caution on is kind of a best practice is to think out your swim lanes before you start your mapping process. This will make it a lot easier. Trying to add a lane in later can be a little difficult if you've already got a lot of your diagram done. However, we do want to say that if you did miss a swim lane, definitely go and add it in. Because if you find that you have a need for a swim lane for a part of your process that's missing, if you ignore it, then you're not doing yourself any service because your map will be incomplete and then of less value. So, but again, best practices, take a few minutes up top, think about who all might be involved in your process, get those lanes out, and then begin the actual diagramming process. Now, another thing, and this was one of our areas of importance for us, and we have a couple things to say here, so we're going to kind of mix a lesson learned into this particular tip. But we caution that if you're looking to work in the area of process improvement, such as we were, it is best to start with your map in what is known as an as-is state. So what that means is whatever is actually happening, that's what you want to get in your map. Now, this may end up being different than any kind of documented process you have or things like that. These things happen over time. And why we found this to be a little difficult was that everybody feels that if they're going against the set way, that they're doing something wrong. So people don't, number one, it makes people uncomfortable to admit what's actually happening. But I want to also caution, though, that if things are being happening in a way that's different from the standard plan, there may be a reason for that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that something is bad. Maybe the defined way wasn't working and this other way developed over time. So that's one piece of advice you can give your people if they're feeling uncomfortable with this. But it is really important to have the as-is state because, as I mentioned before with the missing swim lane, if you are missing pieces of what's actually happening, it becomes very difficult then to try to improve those. So if you're looking for areas of inefficiencies, they may not be showing up on your map because they're happening, but you didn't actually map them. So this is one of the critical areas for us for process improvement, is starting with the as-is state.
So with that, I'll talk about some icons. As Charles mentioned earlier, there are countless icons for BPMN. There's a bunch. And just to create a process map for what you're doing, to get usable information, you don't need all of that. You can get by with just a handful of different icons and a couple different lines, and you can create a very effective and efficient map that shows the information you're wanting to convey without having to constantly reference like a key to see what each different icon means. So I'm going to kind of take you through those different icons here. And on this little image you're seeing on the screen here, that's all you need, really. It's very simple, and definitely to make these maps efficient and usable in the future, simplicity can really be a strong tool. So first off are the task boxes, just the basic rectangles you saw. They're used just to indicate a task, something that needs to be done. Process, X moves to you, you say in your rectangle, complete process X, and you pass it on. Next up, and it's something we touched on earlier, it's sub-process boxes. This is your rectangle with a plus sign. They're used to show another business event or process that's going on or is referenced by your process, but doesn't contribute anything by actually being fully mapped out in your process map. Like we said earlier, you want to narrow scope, and you want to just do one process at a time. And if your process references other processes, you can reflect that using a sub-process box. After that are your start and end events. Best practices here is you want just one start event. In my experience with the maps that I've created, usually that one start event is always going to be the customer defines a need. And usually they kick it to ITS so we can help them with that need. But over the event, the entirety of your map, you're probably going to have multiple end events, and that's perfectly fine. That's best practice. One start, multiple ends, because as you go through it, there's plenty of instances where a service can end. If you're providing a quote to a customer, they want to get in on some service, they have to pay money, you give them the quote. It would then go to an option where they can say, yeah, I want to continue, or no, and the process ends. So you would put an end event there. Next up, we'll talk about some lines. There's solid lines and dashed lines that I usually use. Solid lines, just the flow of a task. You complete step 1, it moves to step 2, and you just use a solid line to indicate that. Dashed lines indicate a communication flow. There's no actual work exchange. It's just, just a communication. I don't know how to explain that better, but in the live demo we show you later, there'll be some instances of dashed lines indicating just a pure communication thing. And
So
finally, yeah,
I'm going to jump in, Chuck. Sorry to interrupt you. One example of a place where you would have that communication line might be if part of your process is where you would send out, say, an email notification, like a status update. So that would be one example of where you might have the dash line indicating communication. Right.
Absolutely. And then the final thing I'm going to touch on are gateways. These are the diamonds. And the majority of time when I'm building my process maps, they're used to designate a decision point. A lot of times it's, you provide the quote to the customer and you ask them, do you want to proceed? Or, anything, just a decision point, yes or no, or multiple answers, whatever it needs to be, just a question, and then it moves on. But then we go to Charles.
So I have another tip related to the gateways. So this, again, is the diamond. There is another thing they can be used for. So this is something that we didn't use a lot when we were doing our mapping, but we want to draw attention to it because we found that as we were getting more experience with process mapping, that we had actually violated best practice, and this would have been the way to accommodate it. So gateways, in addition to being used for decision points, can also be used to designate parallel path events. So this would be a case where, so let's say that you have something that comes in. So let's say you're receiving a phone call. So customers calling into your center. And this call could be taken either by student employees or full-time employees. It depends on whoever gets to the phone first, basically. So in your process map, if you have different lanes for student employee activities and full-time activities, you could use the diamond then to designate this. So basically the call would come in, it would hit the diamond, which it initiates the path split. One of those would go up to your students for the call receiving task. Another one would split down to the full-times, also with the same thing. Now, the next step, if you're doing parallel paths, is that when those tasks are completed, they would also go back to another diamond to merge this back into a single path. So another case where this could happen, so another example, since this one's a little more complex, would be a case of where, so let's say that I am needing to buy a piece of software. So I need Visio because I want to do some process mapping. So I may need to get approval from my supervisor to do that. And then my supervisor may need to get approval from their unit director, for example. And then this may need to also get approval from the purchasing person. So from a perspective, you could look at what's happening here is there's this approval process, but it involves several different people providing that. And so this could be another example where you would split the diamond and there would be an approval piece for each of those people. So if you had the supervisor level, the unit director level, and your purchasing person. And then again, once those are all accepted, hopefully, since I want the software, it would merge back into a single path to move on to the next phase of the purchasing process. So those are some cases where that could happen. And we'll talk about where we made a mistake earlier because we weren't familiar with that notation when we were starting out. The last tip that we kind of want to wrap up with is, so as Chuck's walking through and showing these pictures of these maps and doing the live build, we're using Visio, which is kind of the standard diagramming tool that's used. But we're well aware that people may be operating on a budget. And so there is another tool that we would like to promote, which is called Visagi Modeler. Now, there are other tools that you can make diagrams out there with, but part of the reason we promote Visagi, and I have the URL here if you're interested, is that our business architecture team, our BizArch team, is using either Visio or Visagi in there. So if we were to share maps with them, we would want to use something that they could use. But then another thing for the license savvy people is that Visagi's license actually does allow for uses in universities or corporations. So it is a free license to use. They do have a premium product as well, but in their basic free license, it is covered. So it's not simply a personal use license. So you can use this product legitimately at the university. So that is another reason why we promote that particular tool.
Cool. So with those tips out of the way, I'm going to do a demo, a little live build using Visio. As you all can see, I've kind of got the basics set up. I've already got my swim lanes in place. And I'm going to walk you through our lab stats, new customer request. We've used lab stats for reporting for a while, and with the COVID-19 situation, they've offered a way for you to use your lab stats to allow students, staff, and faculty to remote desktop into your computer labs on campus. And since then, we've had quite a few people asking to get, you know, how can I get in on lab stats so I can make this available for my students? And so here we're going to build a process map for it. The swim lanes we already have in place. We have all of our actors, the customer, of course, most important. ITS, in this instance, it's me because I'm the administrator for our lab stats instance on campus. We got lab stats themselves because we'll be needing some information and some quotes from them, and our ITS business office for actually processing the software for us and doing the chargebacks to the customers. So those are our 4 swim lanes, our 4 units that are going to be involved in this. As we started earlier, everything starts with a start point. So we're going to throw in our start. I like to label it just so we all know it's the start. And like I mentioned earlier in my experience, usually it's the customer identifies a need. And then they ask ITS about it. Now you can use your labeling in the boxes, and I'm sure there is a best practice on how to label these. I am not the master on all of the fine details about process mapping and how to use it effectively. That's definitely Charles in this instance, but I'm just walking you through how I do it. So customer identifies a need. We have our start, and then they ask me a question. So I'm going to put a box down here in ITS. They're going to send me a message and say, "Hey, Chuck, what can you tell me about LabStats remote access?" So I'm going to indicate that with a dotted line there. So then my task here is going to be review service with the customer, and I'll provide a rough quote. I can't tell them the exact price without contacting LabStats, but I have a pretty good idea on what it'll cost. So I provide that information to the customer, and then the customer has a decision to make, and I'll represent that with the gateway. And it's a real simple one. Do they want to proceed? Oops, I should spell it right. That's how you can tell we're actually doing this live, is you'll get to watch me make all of my spelling mistakes here on the screen. So, I'll ask the customer if they want to proceed. I'm going to represent this with a dotted line because dotted lines are fun. And then the customer has a decision to make. Do they want to go through with it? And they can say essentially here, yes or no. So I'm going to label this line coming out here as a no and take it into an endpoint. So if we give them a quote, or we give them the information, this is what it does, this is how you will get involved, here's what I think it'll cost, they could say no right there, and we're at our first endpoint. Or they could say this sounds great, and we're going to call that a yes. So let me draw a line down here to this box, and we're going to label this box yes, they want to proceed. And so from here, it kicks it down to a task for me to do. So I'm going to submit request to LabStats for quote. Easy enough. I shoot LabStats an email asking for a quote. Now, LabStats, they're going to have their own process for this. I'm going to be the start point if they were doing their process map. So I'm going to actually use a sub-process box here saying, they've got their own thing they can do, and I stuck that in the LabStats lane. But we don't need to show any of that here. It does not contribute to what I'm doing. So we'll do a dotted line down to here. And we're going to call, yep, go ahead.
I would say one point of clarification too. So not only does it not contribute to the map that we're trying to build, but another reason why you might use this is to slip in one of our lessons learned too when we were working on this. Before we knew much about sub-process boxes, we came up with this concept of a black box. And what we meant by that was that this was something that when we were handing it off to a different team, we knew they had a process, but we had no idea what it was. And basically for the purpose of our map, it doesn't matter that we don't know what that is.
Yep.
So it's not our job to determine that or fix it. And that's something that you could spiral into the weeds if you attempted to do. And you'd probably be wrong anyway if you were guessing.
Yeah.
So just clarification that would be another reason to use a sub-process box would be if it is something that is outside of your team's purview, that's how you would handle it. You say this team does this task, but you don't necessarily know what their process is.
100% right there. So continue on. I submit my request to LabStats to get me a quote, and then they provide it back to me. That's their own sub-process. Doesn't matter how they do it. All that matters is that I get a quote in the end. So they're going to actually provide me a quote. So I'm going to use a solid line, and they kick it up to me. And then my job at this point, my task is to pass quotes to the customer and ask to proceed. Oops, that's not how you spell proceed. That is. So yeah, I get the quote, I pass it to the customer, and then the customer has another decision to make, another gateway. They get what it costs. So let me draw a line up to there. And then they have to answer the question, do you want to proceed? And then from there, it's the same thing as before. They can either say no, and we go to an endpoint. Oops, come on back. There we go, endpoint. Or they can say yes, and it kicks it back to me to complete the next step of the process. So I'm going to put that there. We're going to do some lines to proceed, no or yes. And oops, we're going to label these. No, oops, no. And yes, and one tip I would definitely say, one lesson learned, is when you go to a gateway for a decision like this, it's always good to label the lines, the outcomes, because the answers are circumstantial. So do you want to proceed, yes or no? I'd like to label the lines just to show how that flows through. I don't know if there's some business practice. Charles, you'd be the one to answer that. But definitely a strong tip is to, when you get to a gateway for a decision, label those lines coming out of it, just to help make the map a little more legible. But if they say, yeah, we want to go through with it, I fill out our, it's here at K-State, it's called request for supplies. Every institute calls it something differently, but fill out the purchase order, and I'm going to submit to ITS business. So I do my task, and then it's going to kick down here to this bottom line, which is our ITS business office. And then we're going to do a solid line here. We're going to go down here. And then, oops, that is incorrect on my part. That should not be a task. That is a sub-process, because ITS business office, they're going to have their own way of doing it. I'm their start point saying, hey, we need to buy this software. So they're going to have their own process. So we're just going to say submit purchase. So they submit their purchase to LabStats, which is another sub process up here in LabStats. I need that tool. So they're going to submit their purchase up to LabStats, and they're going to do, receive and process purchase. And we don't need to include what ITS business office is doing or what LabStats is doing here. A sub process box just shows that, hey, they're doing work. It's not relevant here. But finally, the LabStats, they do their process, they do their purchase, or, they complete the purchase. And then they send me an email. So I'm going to do a dotted line for a notification. And they're going to send me an email saying, hey, Chuck, you got X number of new licenses in your account. Here's how you access them. Thanks for being such a great guy, Chuck. And they say that every time I talk to them. They just say, hey, Chuck, thanks for being so awesome. So it kicks it back up to me. I have the notification from LabStats that the licenses are now in place. So I have some jobs to do now. So first thing I got to do is I have to document license, or document new license info, because documentation is important. And I always kick myself in the rear every time I forget to document things. Next up in my task, and I'm going to have a series of tasks in a row. So I'm going to represent each one of these from a new task because they do, usually I do them one after the other. If I'm working on multiple things all at once, I could use a gateway to show parallel paths. That's correct, right, Charles?
Yeah, that is correct. Sorry,
Okay.
I was muted.
Not a problem. So my next task here is going to be create user accounts and the groups for their department in lab stats. So, and that's just me doing some work. So we're going to do a solid line between these two right there. And the next task I do in this is I notify a customer. I provide them some information. So we're going to go provide. Oh, if I could spell provide. I still mess that up. Good job, me. Provide. And we're going to provide license info. We're going to provide, billing info, mainly when the license, the bill comes up every year. I'm going to provide them the installers so they can install the lab stats clients on their lab computers. I'm going to give them info for lab stats training department. I'm going to give them their tech support for lab stats contact. And then, any additional. So we'll just, if they're going for the lab stats remote, there's another item that they need to contact lab stats about. And that would all be included in this task for me. I create one communication for labs from myself, from ITS to the customer, representing all of that information. And then once I kick that up to the customer, that takes us to our final endpoint. The customer has their information. They're good to go at this point. Anything else from here on would be a new process. So if they contact me and say, hey, Chuck, this isn't working, that would be a new process. That would be, lab stats trouble ticket. Or, hey, Chuck, we can't get, this computer to work with lab stats remote. That would be another trouble ticket. So a separate and new process map that I would create. So for, a customer requesting to be onboarded with our lab stats instance on campus, that's the entire process. That's end of the line. Congratulations, you're now a lab stats customer. Yeah, that's it. Anything else you want to add on this, Charles, before we move to the next section?
Yeah, so one thing that we're not really going to address in this session, just due to time, is if you were looking to do process improvement, how to use this map to do that. Chuck does have an example here, though, so I did want to highlight it. So if you go up to after he gets the information back from LabStats, so it is, nope, you were already where I wanted to be.
My bad.
So where it starts with document new information. So you see we have a chain of events here that are all being done by Chuck. So this is one area where an improvement might be possible. So chains of events done in the same area are a way where automation may come into play as a way to improve. And so I just wanted to highlight that. I'll also note, if you are going back and watching sessions from Chuck later, or you missed the session earlier, Angela Chauncey and Nancy Burgess's session on process mapping, or process modeling rather, gives more information on how to analyze and use the data that you obtain in your map. So I would point to that there, just because we're not going to be covering that in our session. And if you would like to see an example of where process mapping was used to help facilitate things, there was another K-State session led by Darcy Potroff and Stacy Devine. So I would check that one out too. That one was the business of IT, or the value of IT in business, or something. The title's escaping me right now, but so that's all I wanted to add on there. And then I think, and Chuck can correct me if I'm wrong, we're ready to maybe talk about a couple lessons learned from this, and then we'll go into our question period. So one thing that that's a strong lesson learned. You could also classify it as a tip, is if you want to engage in doing process mapping, start with the idea that your map's not going to be perfect the first time.
Absolutely.
Because it won't be. And the other thing too is that one thing we found was when we were asking people to help with these, people got really worried that they were going to do it wrong. And what Chuck and I would suggest is just get something on paper.
Yeah.
Because you're going to iterate through it, and getting it on paper. Well, I say that when in reality we're using
paper,
Visio,
right?
But getting something down is critical, because otherwise you can sit and just spin your wheels and not move anywhere.
Right.
If you get too worried about doing it correctly.
Yeah.
That ties back to our tip of using just that handful of symbols. So you don't need to worry about learning 300 some symbols or whatever. You can just start with a handful.
Yeah. And kind of expanding on that, it's like any, paper or article you would submit. You're going to have multiple drafts as you refine it, as you get it kind of honed in on what you want it to represent. Most of the process maps that I've created, especially the very large process maps, it's not uncommon for me to go through 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even more refinements and iterations of a process map as I rough draft it and I work through it, and I just get it kind of honed in to where it actually is a true representation of the process being done. So yeah, definitely, as Charles said, you're not going to do it right the first time, and that's part of the process. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And kind of, again, related to that as well, is if you go in with that mindset, it makes this easier for you to accomplish as well. Because if you go in putting a lot of pressure on yourself that you have to do it right and whatever to start out with, it just makes everything miserable. And, this does require some work. I will say, though, it doesn't take as much time as you might think. So one of the examples that we had done in our case was we were looking at calls that were coming in for help needed in a classroom.
Yep.
And that map, it was one of the ones I think Chuck showed in the fine print that you couldn't read earlier.
Yeah.
But it turned out it had several swim lanes, it had a ton of steps and all that. And it was huge. And it was one of those things that I'm sort of losing my train of thought now as I got sidetracked, so I apologize on that. But the thing is when we were making that, it was how much time it took. So there we go. Chuck's pulled it up. So This looks monstrous. In reality, there were 5 of us working on that. So 3 on the immediate team that takes these calls. Myself and one of my teammates were kind of helping with just the process part of this. And we actually put together, there was a few refinements afterward, but we put together basically this map in roughly an hour.
Yeah.
So
the groundwork was laid out. I did, like I said, I went through several versions of this in Visio, just kind of getting it honed in. But yeah, the core of it was done maybe an hour.
Yeah. And another thing I'd like to note on that too was, while we did have Chuck had Visio fired up and was working on it to facilitate the process, we also made use of some, old school technology. We basically used a whiteboard.
Yeah.
So we started sketching this out in kind of the brainstorming phase on the whiteboard. And then as we were making sure we had things correct, then Chuck would get that into Visio as we move forward.
Absolutely.
So you can go through the brainstorming part of the map too without necessarily using the technology tool to document it. Right. I would say though that if you are using whiteboards, make sure you're grabbing pictures of them because you're inevitably going to run out of space. So as you saw, as Chuck was scrolling through this, there's no way we could have fit this on a standard whiteboard.
Right.
So this was probably on the order of, I don't know, I'm going to make up a number and say maybe 8 or 9 full whiteboards worth of information that we had.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
So with that though, so those are kind of some of the big lessons that we learned. We'd like to go ahead and open up for questions at this time.
Real quick, if anyone does want a copy of some of these example process maps we provided, feel free to email either of us and I'll be happy to send it your way, send some of our examples your way for reference material for your own use. But yeah, questions?
All right, this is John with the ESU again. We did get a couple questions, and I first off want to thank you both for a very informative session. I certainly have a couple takeaways for my own use. But right off the top, you mentioned it earlier on, but can you go over the other tool that you mentioned that's akin to Visio that users that aren't on Microsoft might be able to use?
Yeah, that, and Chuck, if you want to go back to that slide with
There it
URL,
is.
it is called, and I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong. We have I'm thinking of one of our project management people that's going to yell at me because I always mispronounce it, but Bizagi is how I pronounce it. I think it might be BizAgi because it's business agile is what it stands for.
That sounds horrible. Let's go with Bizagi.
Bizagi. The particular product is called Modeler, so Bizagi Modeler. And we have the URL here if you want to grab a screenshot.
Yep.
And that's how you can get that. Now you will need to create an account with them, but that account is free. Basically, you just need to sign up with an email address is all it really takes.
Yep.
And then they'll give you the way to download the product and install it. And then you will need to use that account to sign in periodically when you're using the product. So
we did find some other providers out there that came up with Visio equivalents, but their licenses were not compatible with our usage on campus. So that's definitely why we would recommend you look at Bizagi here. Because as Charles mentioned earlier, it does have a license that is available to use under the free account for higher education.
Fantastic. Earlier, kind of towards the end there, you were talking about some of the repetitive tasks or some of the inline tasks that might allow for the use of automation. Are there specific use cases, or is there maybe a Microsoft tool that you've tied into Visio that you found to be beneficial for your own work?
the answer to that would be, at least for Chuck and I, would be no. So we haven't gotten to that phase yet. So we have had some takeaways of places where we can increase. When it comes to automation, that's a little more tricky. One thought, so we are a ServiceNow user, and so ServiceNow does have automation tools. I don't know if we have the particular license for those at this point, but if we were using ServiceNow as an example, basically when it got to that chain, it could be built that Chuck would start the documenting process, and as he's filling out a form or something to get that information in, it could kick off those other parts. So it might tie in to be able to create the account and then generate an email that would send out to the customer with their information in the installer.
Yeah.
So that's an example. Like I said, we haven't actually done that. Now that's not saying that there are other places at K-State that's doing these things. They may have had some places, but in our experience, we don't have that yet.
Yeah.
Okay. And one other question, what training have you taken, or what in your past has kind of helped you develop this expertise?
Let me start on this first, Charles, because mine is the easy one. My training is I just like playing around in Visio, and then training that Charles has provided me. And then Charles can give a real answer, which has actual information in it.
So the answer to the question is, in terms of training, it's actually been fairly minimal, but we've actually accomplished a lot with that minimal training. So some of it for me, this was an area that I identified looking ahead to things like our reorg and stuff like that, that this could be useful. So I did do some self-study. So Google searching, process mapping, went to the BPMN site and read through their documentation. But we also had our other teams. I mentioned the BizArc team, which Angela, that I referenced from one of the earlier sessions, is a member of. And they have provided a couple events where they've done some training sessions as well. And so I sat in on those. And one of the roles that I have at K-State is that I work with the IT training. And Then if you want to go a little further back in time, I used to be an instructor. Chuck actually was as well. So that's something people don't tend to think of us as, but we were instructors. And so when it came to the ITAC team, basically I ran through the training. So whether they learned anything or it was terrible, that's on me. But I did kind of what we did here today, where I went through the basics, got people started. And then as we started working through them, that's where we learned a little more about process mapping. So we mentioned the sub-process boxes. That was discovered by one of our other team members who is not with us in the presentation, named Kale. So he was the one who came up with the concept for the black box idea. And then he went out and looked and he goes, oh, there actually is something for this. And it went from our generic black box to a sub-process box. So minimal training, just get in the thick of it, start doing it, and then Google questions on how to map a certain thing if you don't know how to map it. And that's really all it took to get us started.
Okay. Well, I greatly appreciate your time. Unless you have any other parting shots, I think that pretty much will wrap up this session for us.
Cool stuff.
We'd just like to thank everybody who joined us today.
Yeah. Feel lucky that you got to see us in action. It's a wonderful thing. And thanks for watching.